Labour banks. I suppose the bit that caught my eye was they referred as to the opinion poll, we'll say, laid bare the extent of disillusionment with politics among voters hit hardest by the economic crisis, and often referred to as the last generation. Those aged 18 to 45 dominate what has become a phenomenon whereby more than 1/3 of the electorate has turned its back on the mainstream, and specifically on the party led by Eamon Gilmore. And the line that really caught my eye was that the poll shows that this cohort, especially angry young women, they call it, are apathetic best, but are more likely to be disillusioned with the manner in which the country is run. I suppose I fall into that category.
In what sense?
In that I would say that I would be part of that last generation, as they term it here, and I would say
you don't look to me like a lost person.
Certainly not, but I suppose this is going on the average, but it refers to, we'll say, that people would have bought apartments, and that they would be heavily in debt now, and then people that have been unfortunate to have lost their jobs, and you know that they're turning their back on politics because they're so disillusioned with it all.
Yeah.
Whereas I suppose in my own personal circumstance, I was left a full-time job in Dublin in 2008, when I suppose things were starting to go a bit sour, and when I moved home I set up my own practice, and so I couldn't afford to buy a house. So at the time I was kind of feeling sorry for myself that I had nothing, but as it turns out or transpires, you know, it was probably the best thing that happened.
Why do you get one for a snip by comparison now?
Absolutely, you would of course, but I'm turning out investment in agricultural land and houses, because I think you'll get a better return on that.
Well, that's good to know. Logan, did you have a look at any of that coverage?
Yeah, well, I think the thing I really liked about was the headline, just no trust in Labour or banks. For a Labour Party supporter, the juxtaposition of Labour, putting Labour and banks in the same sentence really will create, I think, a lot of Labour support. It does show, I think, where the government is with the banks. That the fact that we're 5 years into this banking crisis, we've had the change of government, and the change of government hasn't led to any improvement in the banking sector. We still see the same headlines come out about banks not lending to SMEs, and Labour are going to have to take the blame for that, along with Fine Gael, because they were elected to change how things were happening. We see Fianna Fáil level with Fine Gael and Posmo, which I just find astonishing. Like, the reason we voted these people out 3 years ago is because of what happened up to the boom, and the same people are still there. Micheál Martin was in the cabinet up till 2008, 2009, and he's now the most popular party leaders in the country. So that change in the tone, I think, is hurting Labour more than it's hurting Fine Gael, because Labour are seen to be elected as the party on people's side, and they're not following through on that.
Aileen?
I suppose that's, you know, I suppose when you are the second partner in government, you're always going to take the hit, and it's very hard to deny, you know, that huge amount of people who have massive mortgage arrears, massive mortgage debt, and who can't see a way out. Why, you know, it's very hard for them to have faith in the banks when they've been given such a huge amount of money from the government, and in the government party that said that they would help dig them out of what Fianna Fáil had led them into.
Yeah, though there was another article saying that 25% of people had returned to trust in the banks. Conor, did you read that?
Well, it's not so much that 72% of people said they had no trust in the banks or did not believe the banks were acting fairly, which means that 28% or 1 million people who live in Ireland think the banks are acting fairly or don't know. Now, this is despite the fact that these institutions behaved as recklessly as a drunk in a Las Vegas casino during the boom years. Then they lost all their money by putting it on black and it came up red. Took 64 billion euros from the state. Then it became as tight as Rod Stewart's trousers when it came to giving money to small or medium businesses or homeowners or whatever it might be. And still they retain the trust, or at least a third of people think, or close to a third of people think that they may not be acting unfairly, which I think is quite remarkable. I would imagine that the percentage of people who don't trust the banks should be well into the 90s, given the way they've behaved over the last 10 years or so. But sure, that's the nature of it. It's also interesting that a lot of people believe that the banks shouldn't engage in any kind of debt forgiveness for people who have distressed mortgages. Close to a third of people believe banks should not countenance any kind of debt forgiveness, which I think highlights the whole notion of the what's the phrase that everyone uses? Wrigley Bank, blank. It doesn't matter.
Moral hazard.
Moral hazard.
Yeah.
Moral hazard issue is still a really big deal for a lot of people. But it's funny that they retain a little bit of support.
Yeah. Nobody ever talks about the banks in terms of moral hazard, but anyway, Michael?
Well, no, I just feel that I think I'm not trying to plug my current production of An Enemy of the People, but the great line. No, but I'm not. But the great line in that is the majority is not always right, and it takes a while. It says it takes 50 years for the majority to be right sometimes. And what happens is that we look at Iceland, whereby the public are not right in this case, and I just think we all look at polls, we talk about them as if they're right. And they got rid of the government, and then they put in exactly what you're talking about, Logan. They put in the people who got them into the mess, they put them straight back in again. And I think that's what's happening here, and I just don't think the majority is always right, and I know that's a controversial thing to say. The other thing is that Owen Harris has a very interesting piece about looking at naming the Labour, the big wigs, the people in Labour, and they're saying they're just heading for their pensions. And it's the people, it's the backbenchers and neighbours who are really going to suffer. And it is interesting, as Lorcan says, to have Labour and banks in the same headline. It's extraordinary, and it's also interesting that we sort of accept it. That's what's interesting about it.
Well, do we? I mean, that's the first time I've ever seen that.
Well, we accept that Labour are not trusted, and we accept that if you look at what's happened with if you look at what happened with the Minister for Health, James Riley, the way Labour supported that, if you look at what happened with Michael Lowry, the way Labour supported that, and if you look at what happened with, I've forgotten his name, Phil Hogan, they supported that as well. But I do think if you're a hard-bitten Labour supporter, I think going through at least even those three, I think you would be very, very distant.
But I think the hope for Labour, the only hope that Labour have now is that they still have 2 years, maybe 2.5 years in which to turn things around. And if in 2 years' time we are in a slightly better place than we are today, we will be in a much better place than we were 2 or 3 years ago when Labour came to power, and they might be able to salvage some support. But I mean, they're on 11% now, which would be absolutely disastrous for the party in any election.
Well, it would be disastrous in terms of the people who have seats now, but it kind of reflects where Labour tend to be, always.
Yeah, well, certainly, I mean, Labour is one of these parties that they go in peaks and troughs. I mean, for every time they get a real boost in the polls, like the spring tide in the 1990s, the very next election they were hammered, and then they go back up and they go down. Like that's the nature of the party, and I don't think I can never see that changing.
They do tend to get, I suppose, a none of the above vote, that people won't vote Fine Gael and won't vote Fianna Fáil because one of them was previously in power, so Labour's kind of almost who you vote for instead. And I think what we might see in the polls going forward is that it might be Sinn Féin that might start pick up that none of the above vote.
Although they haven't done so well in recent polls. I mean, they've kind of stagnated on the 17 to 19%.
Which for Sinn Féin is, like, historically in the last 40, 50 years, 17% is a huge vote for Sinn Féin. So I think they may be feeling that, so they're feeling in that position that Labour had, and Labour has to try and fight for some Labour ground that they're not getting at the moment.
I suppose not unrelated, we have Daniel McConnell in the Sunday Independent writing about taxes, which is, of course, is obviously part of the whole reason that people are probably turning against Labour, fairly or unfairly. Aisling, you picked that one out as well.
Yeah, we'll say
we're being hammered by taxes.
Oh yes,
that was Daniel McConnell.
Yeah,
in Sunday Independent.
Yeah, that particular one. It was in respect of a recent report whereby it was said that Ireland was one of the fairest countries for income tax and income redistribution systems in the world. And Daniel McConnell, there's a good piece in it, and he just highlights the fact that that the survey wasn't I suppose reflective of what actually is occurring in Ireland, because you have, I suppose, these the stealth taxes that weren't factored into the income tax band. And he mentions, we'll say, that in terms of new taxes introduced since 2007, you have your income levy, you have the universal social charge, non-principal private residence charge, domicile levy, insurance levy, water tax pending, your household charge, etc., etc. And then also we'll say the increases from the VAT. He incorrectly refers to capital gains tax and capital acquisitions tax rate at 30% is actually 33% since the 5th of